Hello, I'm Jen. Welcome to Artisan Stitch. This video is another in my dressmaking techniques series, and this will cover how to sew a V-neck facing. Now, facings are a method of finishing off the insides of necklines and armholes. They're basically a strip of fabric which lies around the inside of the opening, and they help shape and support the neckline or the armhole, keeping the shape of the garment and preventing distortion in those high traffic areas, if you like. So this will cover a couple of techniques, including one of my favourite little tricks called understitching. That's the understitching. Helps the facing lie on the inside, so it doesn't keep popping around to the outside. And it also helps keep your the shape, give you this beautiful invisible finish. So continue watching and I'll break it down step by step. I have my front bodice piece cut on the fold, my back bodice piece also cut on the fold. It would probably be more common for the back to be done in two pieces, and there may be some sort of fastening. Certainly if you had a dress, there would be a zip down the back. But because this is one of my miniature samples, I've just cut them both on the fold. I also have my facing, so there's the back facing. I've applied interfacing to that and to the front. And this is a gentle, soft V-neck shape, which I think is quite a nice, flattering design. So the first thing I'm going to do is to join my shoulder seams, both of the garment. So I'm going to place my back and front right sides together, join across the shoulder seams. I'm going to neaten the edges and press them. I'm also going to join the shoulder seams of the facing. So again, the short edges, back and front, like so. Oops, my notches are not matching. I've not done a good job of cutting that. And this one. Now, because this is my miniature sample done on a small scale, I'm going to be using 1 centimetre seam allowances throughout, but you would be following your pattern and it would be more likely you'd be using 1.5 centimetres or 15 millimetres, or if you're still in old money, 5/8 of an inch. That's all my shoulder seams done. You are probably wondering why on the back facing we have this little edge sticking out, and you'll notice that I have joined the fabric at the base of that shape, so that will become apparent once we press the edges open. So I'll go and do that now and I'll come back to you once I've done it. Right, I've pressed the shoulder seams. I have overlocked across the top. Now, because this is a lightweight fabric, I chose to neaten the two edges together, and I'll be pressing it towards the back of the garment. But if you've got a thicker fabric, you can neaten each shoulder seam allowance separately and press them open. So on the facing, that's what I've done. Again, I've just given them a light trim. I've pressed them open. Now that little corner, the reason that is shaped like that is when that back section folds backwards, it's now in alignment with the shape of the back neck there. And on the outer edge, Your edges should be even, so we'll have this neat outer edge all the way around. This is the inside, the hole in the middle if you like. This is what's going to go around the neckline. So I'm going to now neaten around the edge of this outer edge of the facing. You can do that with zigzag, you can do it with overlocking, or quite often patterns will tell you to do a clean edge, a straight edge stitch, which is just folding in a small amount, maybe 5 or 6 millimeters, and straight stitching it down. Now that does add bulk because you're creating an extra layer of fabric. It's quite an old-fashioned method actually, usually because back in the day when you only had straight stitch machines before the swing needle machine was invented, it can look quite nice sometimes, so it's not to be discounted, but it's not my preferred way. I'm just going to run the overlock around it. Now again, I would choose a matching thread. I have my overlocker set up with its colour combination, ready for my overlocker tutorial. And I think for the purposes of demonstration for this video, you can see clearly where the overlocking is. Having neatened the edge of the facing, the next stage is to apply it to the neckline of the garment. So I am going to turn the garment the right sides out. You'll notice I haven't done the shoulder seams yet. That makes it easier to put the facing on if you leave the garment flat. So I've got the right side of the fabric, the right side of the facing. So I'm matching my V-neck, and I've put a small dot, transferred the small dot that was on the pattern onto the wrong side of my facing, and that is the bottom of the V. So I'm going to use that as my first pinning point, and also I'm going to match at the shoulder seams. Making sure the seam allowances on the garment at the shoulder point towards the back. Right round the back of the neck to the next shoulder seam. Okay, pin those together. Sometimes you may get notches on this edge on your pattern, so it's a good idea to make sure you cut the notches and follow them, because that helps with the matching the position. And down this front edge, again just lining the edges of the garment with the facing, and pop a pin through there too. So that's my facing pinned on around the neck edge of the garment. So I'm going to stitch around there now. Now I did say I was using 1 centimetre seam allowance today. This would commonly be 1.5 in patterns, but you should check your individual pattern instructions. Because this is very small and quite fiddly, I'm going to remove the accessories case of my machine so I can slip this over the free arm. There, that's making it much easier. I'm going to start on a shoulder seam. It doesn't actually matter, but I'm going to leave the V. I'm not going to start right at the V. It's the trickiest part, so I'm going to start in an easy section. A little bit reverse stitch, just coming down following my curved neckline. Now, when I come to the V point, I'm going to stop and put the needle in the fabric right on my marked dot. Okay, maybe one more stitch. Move the pin. Right, so I'm now going to pivot, turn the corner. And that is me. I can see I'm lined up with the 10mm mark You can come down the second side. And now I'm back to my starting point. Okay, so there's the facing stitched on all the way around. So next stage, of course, is to go to the iron and give this a press. I've brought you over with me to the iron so you can see what I'm going to do. So first I'm going to just give that a little press to melt the stitching. We go, smooths everything down, drives the stitching into the fabric. So that was the front. Let's do the back. Okay, so again, advantage of not having stitched the side seams is I can keep this flat. Next, I want to open up this seam round here. This is eventually going to be turned round to the inside, but there's a couple of things we need to do first. So again, as I said, we're going to open up that stitching. Again, you can only do a little at a time. Just working my way around with the tip of the iron, just pushing it in. And you can see how that seam's opening up, as opposed to the bit which I haven't pressed yet. You can see how this is lying flatter, this bit isn't. Patience is definitely a virtue when it comes to sewing. No point being slapdash. Okay, I'm just working my way right round. So you get the general idea. You can see how that seam has opened up. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this, and I'll show you what's next. I actually want to show you how to do the V shape, which I forgot earlier. So I'm just bringing the iron down, running the tip into the seam, and at the point I'm coming back up the other side. Okay, so don't worry about little creases at the moment. Work round from the other side. Now I am going to reduce some of this bulk. What is going to happen is the facing will be folded right round and over to the inside of the garment, like so. But what we have here is 2 layers of fabric lying together, plus the interfacing, of course. So I can actually feel, and you can see that ridge. You can see that that's creating a ridge there. So to remove that, I'm going to layer the seams, or grade the seams as it's sometimes called. Now if I cut this one back, the garment one, if I cut the garment one back, that's what's going to show in the front, so there is a possibility that I would still see a ridge here. So the one I'm going to trim back is the actual facing, so the one with the interfacing on it. And again, I'm going to use my small scissors and just introduce it back. It only needs to be a small amount, a couple of millimetres. It just will make that lie flatter. So its whole area is lying much flatter now. I'm going to work my way right round. Again, I'm using my small scissors. It's always a bit risky going in with your big fabric shears, as you could nick something that you don't actually want to cut. So when it comes to the point, again I'm going into that point and coming up the other side. Right, now the point itself, to get a V-neck to lie flat, what we'll have to do is something that looks a bit reckless, but you have to be brave. You need to snip right down as far as you dare, right down into that point. Now again, I have additional layers, so I can just pare a little bit away there and a little bit away here. So the more fabric we can take away from that point, the smoother and flatter your point will be. So there we go. So now I'm going to go around and press again. This time I'm making sure that the seam allowances are pressed towards the facing. Okay, so they're pointing up into the facing. So you'll see I'm working in small sections, just making sure that the area I need to work on is flat and smooth. And you have to work your way around the garment, doing a small area at a time. Now I'm just going to check when this facing is turned to the inside. This curve needs to go the other way. So the way to deal with curves and to get them to lie flat is just to do small snips into the seam allowance, which will allow it to open out and lie round the back neck. So again, I'm doing mine about every centimetre. So now I'm going to go back to the machine and show you that technique I promised of understitching. Understitching is a very useful little trick when you are working with facings. It is basically we're going to be stitching through the facing itself and catching the seam allowances in, hence the reason for pressing the seam allowances up towards the facing. It doesn't show on the garment from the front, you will see it on the inside of the garment only. But it's a great way to make sure that the facings stay inside the garment and don't want to pop out on the neck. So I'm going to do mine fairly close to the seam. So I think I'm going to use the, that's my centre marking where my needle is. I think I'm going to line up the seam with this little slot in the presser foot, and that's going to give me about 3 or 4 millimetres under stitching. This is basically like an edge stitch, so it can be as close as you like to the seam without actually going over it, or it can be maybe up to about 5 millimetres in from the edge. So you can start anywhere you like. I've got my delicious pink thread so you can see clearly what I'm doing. Again, you can see I'm rearranging the fabric in each section, just making sure that the piece I'm going to sew is flat, that I've not got any little bulges, or I'm not pinching up the fabric, pulling it away from each other. We've basically got 2 pieces of fabric, one's a convex curve, one's a concave curve, so they are fighting against each other. Down to the V. So again, I'm holding the fabric flat. We've got excess fabric on this side, so I'm just rearranging it, making sure that it's lying flat. And I may actually be able to get right round this. If you get stuck and get yourself into a tight corner, it doesn't matter, you can stop and start again in an easier to access area. You sometimes cannot get right the round of a neckline. Sometimes you have a little bit of difficulty in tight corners, so don't worry about doing it all. A little amount of understitching is better than nothing at all. Right, so I can actually pivot on the V and I can come around the other side. My starting point, so again, a little bit of reverse. I like to start on or close to the shoulder seams for some reason. As I say, you can start anywhere, but I do always avoid starting close to any tricky point, so that's why I didn't start on the V. It's just slip my threads. Now you can see what that's done. It has stitched right through the seam allowances, holding them towards the facing. So I'm going to go back to the iron now, press the facing to the inside, and we're almost done. Now what I'm going to do is work my way around. I'll probably have the garment open again. I'm doing it from the reverse side so I can see. Now, the effect of the understitching is just to help pull the facing around away from the inside of the neckline. So you can see what's happening. We've got this lovely little roll of fabric. That ensures that the facing isn't going to pop out or roll around. I'll show you what often happens. The facing will want to roll around and be seen from the right side. So we don't want that. We want to see that. Just wants to do it itself when it's understitched. I'm really pleased with that V. That's lying beautifully flat. There we go. I'm just running around to just give that a final press, kind of making sure that this little bead of fabric you see on the inside is even all the way around. The shoulder seams might be a little bit bulky, so if you wanted to go and remove a little bit more of the seam allowances on the inside, you can. Sometimes just need a little bit of pressing. There, that's flattened that out there. And round the back of the neck. Again, you see the effect of cutting, snipping the seam allowance. It's fanning out like that, allowing it to lie smoothly. If you've had problems with necklines before and adding facings and they're all bunching up, it's probably that you haven't snipped into the seam allowances, thereby releasing the fabric, allowing it to bend around the curve. I can see a little sort of pinch of fabric there on that V, so try a little bit more pressing. And if pressing doesn't deal with it, in this case it has, but you can just go back in, make another little snip. Make sure you go right up to the stitching. There, that's better. And if you do that, then you get this beautiful flat V-neck. So V-necks can often be quite troublesome. And I know a lot of people struggle with them, but I think if you utilise those little techniques I've just shown you, the snipping and the understitching, then you won't struggle with them at all. There we go, there's your beautiful little grand neck. It just needs a further bit of pressing here. Inadvertently creased there, so a little bit of pressing. That's what happens when you're working on a small scale. You sometimes catch bits with the iron that you don't want to catch down. So that is how you do your facing. So there you have a V-neck facing with a beautiful, flat, even, crisp edge and a lovely flat V.